Hello everybody, welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I want to talk to you about consciousness. Now this is something that's really cool because this is currently at the forefront of psychology and philosophy. This is something that there's a huge amount of debate of this, there's a huge amount of confusion of this, there's a huge amount of activity on this. This is a really active, fascinating field, and something which spans both science and philosophy. So psychologists, neuroscientists and philosophers, they're all getting involved, as well as people from lots of different disciplines. It's all very exciting. And when it comes to consciousness, I'm actually planning to make a proper trilogy on this, and each episode is going to be like an hour plus. So I have hours of content I can talk about on this. But I want to just give this to you as like a 20-minute thing first, just to sort of, I guess reel you in a little bit. I guess I want you to like microdose Polymath, just to sort of make this a bit accessible, you know, because an hour-long video is a lot. So in this case, I'm going to talk to you about what is this whole problem of consciousness? What is the hard problem? What is consciousness itself? Where does it come from? What are all the different viewpoints? What do you need to know, basically? So, here's the first thing. The hard problem of consciousness is basically how do physical processes give rise to subjective experiences? So how is it? So for example, you're conscious because neurons in your brain are firing, right? Neurons are just cells. They communicate with electricity. So why is it the fact that electricity flowing through meat gives rise to this? Why can you think and feel and just sort of be sentient as a result of that? So that really is the hard problem. And the phrase hard problem was coined by this philosopher and scientist called David Chalmers. And he distinguishes it from easy problems. So easy problems are stuff that is in science, these scientific issues that we don't yet have the answer to, but it's not something which challenges us in this fundamental way. Easy problems are scientific questions that we can ultimately answer within the framework of science. But in consciousness, we can learn everything there is to know about the neurobiology of consciousness. We can learn all about the mechanisms of consciousness. We can know exactly where in the brain it comes from, exactly which neurotransmitters, which cells are involved, and where, and how. So we can learn all these mechanistic explanations. But the problem is, the facts of consciousness don't really follow logically from them. Because actually, let's say, so an example provided by this philosopher called Jackson, is you take this neuroscientist called Mary, and you raise her in a black and white room because, I don't know, maybe you're just bored. You raise this kid in a black and white room, and you only give her access to black and white newspapers, black and white TV shows, all black and white media, and you teach her everything there is to know about the neurobiology of red. So this person knows everything about what the color red is, how it works, what the wavelength of light is, etc., etc. But then she goes outside for the first time and sees the color red for the first time. And most people would say that as she does that, she learns something new. She has this new experience. But that means that you have this massive philosophical dilemma, because it means that the fact that physical processes gives rise to subjective experiences isn't something which is readily explainable, because that fact of what red is actually like is a further fact, to use a term in philosophy, which doesn't logically follow from mechanistic explanations of how consciousness works. So let's just define some key terms in the whole debate on consciousness. Qualia is one of them. A qualia is just a subjective experience. So for example, the subjective experience of seeing the color red is a qualia. The subjective experience of pain or happiness or sadness is a qualia. Consciousness is composed of just a stream of qualia. So robots, for example, or AI don't have qualia. They can still think and compute, but they don't feel while doing so. It's not accompanied by qualia. So ontology in philosophy is just the study of what is real, essentially. The study of what reality is made of. But actually, do you know what? No, explanation first, something to talk about first, is there's this question of consciousness and how qualia work and what qualia are made of and how they relate to the body and how physical process gives rise to subjective experiences is covered by this branch of philosophy called the philosophy of mind. And the philosophy of mind basically talks about what is the mind, how does it relate to the body, how do they interact. It's centered on something called the mind-body problem, which is essentially the fact that the mind and the body seem like two fundamentally different things. They seem like two fundamentally different kinds of reality, and yet they interact somehow. Now, to return to this definition of ontology, ontology is the study of what is real. Now, currently, the ontology of science, so the current scientific paradigm of what's real or not, is physicalist, which basically means that science currently believes that the only thing that is real is the physical world. So matter, forces, energy, space-time, exotic matter, really it all comes down to matter, forces, and energy. So the ontology of modern science is physicalist. So there's one category of things in reality, and that's physical. However, the mind-body problems potentially suggests to some people that we need to expand that ontology to include a physical world, but also some kind of mental world, because it's not readily apparent how the mind would fit into a physicalist ontology. So another key term we need to talk about is epistemology. Epistemology is our study of knowledge, and it's basically like saying, what can we know? So we'll get on to more of that later, don't worry. Another thing to talk about is naturalization. Naturalization is when a phenomenon previously seen as supernatural or unexplainable is made to be seen as a natural scientific process. So for example, the weather, or genes, or growth, or the fact that, or individual differences, or psychology used to be seen as the result of, for example, in Western society, God. And after scientific process, these things were naturalized. We now see these things as normal scientific process. But consciousness, it's not really clear that consciousness can be naturalized, because it doesn't just pose an easy problem, i.e. a problem about mechanisms and how everything works. It seems to pose a kind of philosophical and ontological problem about what actually is real and what is consciousness made of. And if it's made of something which isn't physical matter, then that means that our whole conception of reality is wrong. So another key term is something called the explanatory gap. And the explanatory gap is this term defined by this philosopher called Levine, and he basically just says that like we can't really explain how physical processes give rise to subjective experiences. So there's a gap in our ability to explain stuff. But that explanatory gap can either be caused by ontological stuff. So it could just be that the reason why we're having trouble answering that is because our ontology is currently physicalist, and it shouldn't be. There's some other category of substance, for example, a mental kind of world that we're not talking about. Or the explanatory gap could be epistemological. So the problem could be with our knowledge. It could be that reality is in fact just physicalist. There's nothing else other than physical matter. But there's a problem in human knowledge. So if the explanatory gap is epistemological, it could be that there's some kind of inherent cognitive limitation in humanity that prevents us from ever truly understanding how physical processes give rise to subjective experiences, how physical processes give rise to qualia. But there's also some arguments that that explanatory gap may be epistemological, but only temporary. So it could just be that we currently have an explanatory gap, but as science progresses, we'll be able to explain it. So when it comes to the mind-body problem, there are two big kind of ways of answering this. There's the approach of dualism, which basically argues that instead of just having a physicalist ontology, we need to expand our ontology to contain both a physical world and a kind of mental world. So there's two basic fundamental kinds of matter. Or another answer to the mind-body problem is monism, M-O-N-I-S-M, which basically says reality only has one kind of substance. So our ontology only needs to include one kind of category. That could be just physical stuff. It could be entirely non-physical stuff. It could be that, so this is a bit of a niche position, but it could be that there's no physical matter at all and everything is just in everyone's heads. It could be that there's a third kind of substance that gives rise to physical and mental phenomena. We'll explore more of these positions later. So physicalism, as I mentioned, the belief that the ontology of the world is just physical stuff. It's often used synonymously in philosophy and scientific literature with materialism. In practice, materialism technically is a bit of an older, more outdated concept, which basically says that the only thing in reality is matter. Everything is made out of matter. Now, from the perspective of physics, that actually isn't true. So physics acknowledges that the world is the physical world comprises of matter, but also energy and also forces. I'm going to do another polymath episode on physics and what the basic standard model of physics is. So what the universe is made of, what we think the universe is made of, and what we currently can't explain. So stuff like dark matter, dark energy, stuff that physics currently isn't really explaining. I'm not going to talk about that now though, because that's just for another episode. I think another really key thing to define here is what is consciousness. There's lots of definitions about this. As I mentioned earlier, consciousness can be just seen as a stream of qualia, but a philosopher called Nagel actually wrote a lot about defining consciousness in a really useful way. And Nagel wrote a really famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Because we know what it's like to be a human, but other conscious animals, or bats, cats and dogs, they have a completely different subjective experience of what it's like to be them. So it's not like anything to be a rock. A rock isn't conscious. A rock has no what it's likeness, but an animal does. And we can't ever know that. So we can't ever know what sonar feels like. we can interpret it. We could just like represent sonar in sci-fi as just being like a sound that we hear. So we can basically pretend that the qualia of sonar is just the same thing as the qualia of hearing. But in actuality, it's entirely possible that bats experience that in a completely different way. And that birds, for example, which has a sense of the Earth's magnetism, feel that the kind of qualia for magnetism could be completely different from any kind of qualia that we know about. So for example, there are some people with congenital medical disorders where they can't feel pain. So that the qualia of pain is entirely foreign to them. There's just this fundamental type of experience which they don't know about. That could be what it's exactly like with us for other senses like sonar or magnetism or etc, etc, etc. So Nagel basically says, 1, consciousness is what it is like to be something. 2, just because we can't ever know that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The problem hasn't gone away just because we can't know what it's like to be a bat. 3, in science, we want to describe stuff from an objective perspective. So when we talk about physics and astronomy, for example, we want to be talking about that from an objective, matter-of-fact point of view, where we're trying to just see what things are like. We're not trying to view things from a certain limited perspective. We're trying to take a bird's eye view. But with consciousness, the only experience we have of our consciousness is from our point of view. So we can't really do that here. And point number 4 that Nagel makes is that we can say that consciousness is just brain states. We can say that, okay, consciousness is what happens when electricity flows through neurons which are organized in a certain way. And we can kind of accept that. We can sort of say like, yeah, that makes sense. But we don't really understand it. So for example, if Einstein went back to time and told Socrates that matter and energy are actually the same thing. So you know the equation E equals mc squared? That just stands for energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So that equation just basically says matter and energy are the same thing, but in different forms, basically. Now if you said that to Socrates, Socrates might believe you, he might take your word for it, but he wouldn't really get what you were talking about. So that's just an example of that. So what I'm going to do now is just talk about some of the different views on consciousness, because there's loads of different takes on this, and they're all backed by different bits of philosophy, different bits of science. Some are more scientific than others, admittedly. I'm not going to get too much into these for now, just because we are limited on time, and because I'm going to do all this probably in a future episode, but just a whistle-stop tour of all the different sort of viewpoints on consciousness. One is dualism. Dualism argues that the ontology that we should adopt should consist of both a physical world and a kind of mental world. So for example, dualism basically says, if you had a human being, which was, if you made a thing in a lab, which had the exact same cellular structure as a human being, it had the exact same nervous system as you, and it had the exact same nerves, the exact same configurations, the exact neurotransmitters, all of that, it would still be possible for that being to not be conscious, because consciousness is not just about what you physically are. It's not just about physical stuff. It's about some kind of other mental property as well. Consciousness is the result of some kind of different form of matter, or different form of substance, this mental substance, right? So the idea of a person which is physically identical to you but not conscious is known in the literature as a philosophical zombie. There's two different kinds of dualism. There's substance dualism, which argues that the physical world and the mental world are made up of fundamentally different things. This is the view really commonly associated with a philosopher called Descartes. And there's another sort of more moderate form of dualism called property dualism, which basically says that the only thing that the world is made of, the only substance in the world, is physical. However, that physical substance gives you both physical properties and mental properties. So the idea of a philosophical zombie is still possible. So another variant of dualism is called epiphenomenalism, which basically says that the mental and physical worlds don't interact with each other. You're just conscious as like a side effect of all the workings of your brain. So consciousness is just this kind of unintended side effect of how nervous systems happen to evolve, and they don't actually influence anything. That's really, really controversial because it implies that human beings don't have free will. If consciousness is just a side effect of what your body decides to do, and you're just sort of witnessing it and reacting to it. I talk about whether we have free will in episode 27, by the way. That's its whole kind of thing. So the criticism with dualism really is just either the whole free will thing with epiphenomenalism, and also the fact that if there is a physical world and a mental world and these are separate, how do they interact with each other? And also, what is it? Like, what is this mental world? What is this mental substance or these mental properties? We can't study it, but how do we even get any information on that? What is this ghost in the machine, this kind of spirit inside your head that gives consciousness? So The sort of dominant scientific paradigm is physicalist, and one of the monist answers to the mind-body problem and the answer of consciousness is to say that there's only one form of reality, and that is the physical world, and that these forms of positions are known as physicalist positions. But the physicalism, the position of physicalism, is an umbrella term with lots and lots of different positions on the whole problem of consciousness. So type A physicalism is one kind of physicalism, and it basically says that the explanatory gap doesn't exist. There is no explanatory gap. Actually, we can explain consciousness right now. Consciousness is real, but we can explain it just with brain states. And that might seem like a really difficult thing, but actually that's just an illusion. There's no real problem here, right? So another kind of extreme version of type A physicalism is called eliminative materialism, which basically argues that qualia, these subjective experiences, aren't even real at all. It's just an illusion. Again, I'm going to talk more about these positions and the justification for these positions in the full episode. I just want to kind of tell you about what all these different things mean and what they are. So type A physicalism basically says, if you look at a computer, right? If you look at a computer, it might seem really mysterious how it can do things. But actually, if you break a computer down into all of its different parts, and you can see how all the different parts interact with each other, it all makes a lot of sense. And in reality, if you shrunk down to the size of like a nanometer and you went into a human brain, you wouldn't see any kind of consciousness particle. You'd just see different parts of the brain acting on each other and doing stuff, just like a computer. So type B physicalism says, listen, we don't have an ontological problem. Physicalism is the correct answer. But there is an unclosable epistemic gap. Due to inherent cognitive limitation in humanity, we can never understand how physical processes gives rise to subjective experiences. And no matter how far neurobiology gets, no matter how scientifically and technologically advanced we are, science and technology is never going to answer that. And because humans have inherent cognitive limits, so for example, there is a maximum IQ that an individual has ever achieved, we do have inherent intellectual limits. What's outside those limits is understanding this problem of consciousness, right? So another kind of physicalism is called type C physicalism. Also, all these things, type A, type B, type C, they have lots of other different names. I'm just giving you like a simple taxonomy of physicalism based on one of these aliases for each of these different viewpoints. Type C physicalism says, look, there is an explanatory gap. I acknowledge that. However, that explanatory gap is epistemic. It's a problem with our epistemology. It's not a problem with our ontology. That's common to all physicalist positions. But type C physicalism says that this epistemic gap is closable. We can one day, with advances in science and technology, understand this hard problem of consciousness. Another form of monism is idealism, which basically argues that there's no physical world at all. Everything is just existing in the mind. It's all just mental substances. So either the world is a simulation or God is real and we are all just alive in the eyes of God. This is kind of only believed by one guy, this guy called Berkeley, this philosopher in I think the 1700s, but don't quote me on that. So I'm not really going to address it more here. A final form of monism that I want to talk to you about, which I think is arguably much more interesting, is called panpsychism. And it basically argues that the universe is only made of one thing, so our ontology only needs to have one category. But that one thing is neither physical nor mental. It's something else. And it just has physical and mental manifestations. So these physical and mental worlds are just two sides of the same coin, right? So it means that inherent to all matter, inherent to all things in the universe, is both physical stuff, such as matter, energy, and forces, but it also means that all matter has some form of consciousness, because consciousness is inherent in matter. So rocks have consciousness, wavelengths of light have consciousness, atoms have consciousness. It's not the same kind of consciousness humans have. There's different degrees of sophistication in consciousness, but fundamentally, all things, even inanimate things, are able to have qualia. So this is just like a really whistle-stop tour of all these different positions and a great debate on consciousness. I'm going to get into more of these properly in a future episode. I just think it's nice to talk about this briefly and give like a bit of an overview. I think it's just interesting and hopefully it encourages you to go and do your own research, which is really the whole point of polymath anyway. That's really what I want to encourage. Just encouraging scientific curiosity and getting out there and doing your own research and thinking about all this stuff yourself and doing a bit of critical thinking. That's what I really want to encourage, really. So if you're interested, go out there, look up these positions, try and look up like journal articles, look at actual studies in journals and philosophy. So just type in journal article at the end of your Google search, because otherwise anyone can say anything on the internet. So anyone can define any of these positions however they want. There's lots of misinformation on the internet. But I hope that you've all found that very interesting. And remember, there's no right answer. So It's really up to you. But again, what we know about science backs certain positions more than others. I'm going to talk about that more in the full episode anyway. So, I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you very much for listening, and take care. See ya.